You are now watching the 84th Annual NAACP New York State Conference Convention.
Our final workshop of today's virtual convention is our Economic Development Workshop, hosted by my friend Gary A. Johnson, Economic Chair of the NAACP New York State Conference. Take it away, Gary.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon. My name is Gary Johnson. I am the NAACP New York State Conference Economic Development Chairman. Today we're here to discuss Black and Latino business issues in New York City and New York State. With us are two esteemed guests who have years of experience in this arena. Our guests are the Reverend Jacques DeGraff and Paul T. Williams. But first, we have a few words from our sponsors. Welcome back. Today we are discussing economic development issues with our two esteemed guests. Our first guest shall be Paul Williams. Paul is an attorney, partner in the law firm of Brown, Hatchell & Williams, former president of the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, founding member of Eagle Academy, and also former president of 100 Black Men. Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Gary.
A lot has happened in the last few years in terms of development, in terms of minority businesses in New York City and New York State. One of the most important things that's being spoken about was the PLA. Can you get into that a little bit for us and let our audience know what that's about?
Sure, it's a hugely important issue. But before I do that, I do want to add that I was also first vice president of the Mid-Manhattan branch NAACP early in my career. But that's what has given me a lifelong admiration of the work of the NAACP, and especially a profound sense of gratitude for the work of Dr. Hazel Dukes in that organization for these many years. So I just wanted to put that in there. Project labor agreement, perhaps the most important contractual agreement the city can do as it relates to construction and construction-related opportunities for companies all across the city of New York. Why do I say that? Because a project labor agreement, in essence, says that organized labor will be the predominant workforce for all city contracts, except the contracts that you can accept out or leave out of the PLA. So the city's had a PLA for several years. It's obviously hugely important because the predominant number of minority firms of any stripe are non-union firms. The city of New York has 10,000 NWEs registered. There may be less than 500 minority women-owned firms that are union, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a big issue, and in many ways a problem. Yeah. So the city, in their negotiations that were finalized just last month, did a new PLA. And to the city's credit, they made some advances. But I don't think they made enough advances over their prior PLA. But it is what it is. We have a PLA now. In order to make sure that what benefits exist in the PLA in terms of utilizing non-minority firms for some work, accepting some work from the PLA, having workforce requirements to diversify the workforce, having training requirements, to make sure that the city and our community get at least what we can from this PLA. Many of us, including myself, have been saying that the city needs to engage an outside monitor to monitor not only labor's undertaking under the PLA, but the city's response as well. So I think that's a huge issue that certainly NAACP and other organizations might focus on.
What are the influences to make the PLA more enforceable, and what can we do about that?
Well, to some extent, the best way to do that is to have an independent professional organization monitor and report. Very often in our community, we try to do things basically on a volunteer basis. We'll form committees, we'll form task forces, we'll try to do the work of monitoring and pushing government to do the right thing as a matter of volunteer time outside of our 9-to-5 jobs. And that's great. And believe me, we need all of that and more. But for something like the PLA that encompasses billions and billions and billions of dollars of capital construction, you need an organization that's going to be paid to do the monitoring and the reporting, and an organization that has enough ties to the community one way or the other so that they can get that community input and feedback as well.
Well, some of that feedback and some of that pressure has been put on the city by individuals such as yourself, as well as Reverend DeGraff. Reverend, your work speaks for itself. You've been associate pastor for Canaan Baptist Church. You're a founding member of Eagle Academy. You currently chair, of course, the MBE Leadership Summit, and you're the past recipient of the prestigious New York City MBE Advocate of the Year Award. So the work that you do has been influential in making some of the progress happen. One of the things that's been implemented of late by this administration, the city administration, the de Blasio administration, specifically is the implementation of chief diversity officers. This is something that has been advocated for years by folks such as you, as well as the Comptroller's Office. Can you speak about the Chief Diversity Officer Initiative and what it means and what we need to do?
Yeah, I'd like, first of all, thank you for having me as an admirer and a colleague and an ally of the NAACP and Mama Dukes. I'm a senior vice president in her fan club, and leave it to others to be the president. But what Paul raised is a dimension of our advocacy in terms of participation and codifying it through either legislation or policy. The CDO is a best practice. Chief Diversity Officer. In a legal firm, in a legal situation, you have a chief counsel, a general counsel, who's responsible for legal and contractual kinds of issues. You have a chief human resource officer. You have a chief financial officer. A chief diversity officer is to do just that, to ensure on an ongoing basis that there is inclusion and participation up and down the ladder.
Right.
One of the things that grows out of what you discussed in the PLA is that for many, many years, economic development to us meant jobs.
Right.
And so we were fighting for jobs and workforce issues, collective bargaining. The situation in New York is the building trades have been, the private sector has moved away from organized labor, and so they are left with public works. And in public works, they put an artificial cap on their membership. Now here we come to the table, finally having evolved past job advocacy and now to ownership and business contractual obligations, and we need someone on the other side of the table to keep the door open. And so the Chief Diversity Officer is an individual who is charged with keeping the door open for our participation to make sure. And how many contracts this month went to MBEs? How many, what percentage went to MBEs? And here's what we've been fighting for many years with Mama Dukes and others like yourself leading the charge. And that is this. We tried real hard. We couldn't find any.
And that's been their excuse.
That's been their excuse. Because a chief diversity officer helps create programs to build capacity, to identify existing firms, and to create programs to support those existing firms. After years of being denied access to capital, after years of being denied home ownership and other opportunities, now the door is open and the qualifications sometimes exclude us. And so we need someone there to be a bridge builder and a champion on our behalf. And Paul is too modest to say, but when he was on the public side, he created precedent-setting new advances at DASNY by providing services, not just to workforce, but to public professional services.
Yeah.
So that, would you tell about the $1 billion offering that you...
Well, that too, but I want to double back on the CDO issue specifically, because I agree with everything you said, but I want to add one other dimension.
Sure.
When I came to DASNY under Governor Patterson, MWE utilization in the state was in the single digits. And depending who you believed, it was either 4% or 7% or somewhere in between, right? By the time I left DASNY in 2015, we were up over 25%. And one of the reasons that happened, in part was because I was at DASNY, right? And as CEO and president, I had a prerogative, I made it my prerogative to make MWE utilization a fundamental concern of the organization from top down. So when we talk about a CDO, one of the things we're talking about is having a CDO that's empowered. Not, you can't always have a chief executive officer that's going to have as much concern and passion for these issues as I had.
Right.
But you can have a CDO who's empowered and has that kind of fervent interest, but reports to the CEO. That's what empowers staff in an agency.
It has to have that direct connection to the CEO.
You've got to have a direct connection. You've got to be in that line of senior management, and you have to be someone who's able to stand up, because the procurement process is really buried into these agencies. They're buried into procurement officers, into supplier folks, into the architect department. I mean, to influence it, you have to have top-down influence, because it's hard to influence decisions from the bottom up in these big agencies.
So from the city's perspective, we're saying these chief diversity officers have to have direct access plus resources to access the commissioners or the agency heads directly.
I
right?
believe that's
they can't
the
be
only way.
buried in the system.
Right.
So part of that, how that actually plays out in the operation side, they have to be direct reports, senior reports to the commissioner, and then there needs to be somebody at City Hall who's monitoring them.
Right.
So and for the members of the NAACP, the Paul Williams, for all of his ability, could not exist unless it was identified that there was a constituency that was requiring it, that was supporting it. The problem has been that when Paul Williams walks out the door, then what happens?
That's right.
Right? And so in terms of this administration and any administration, how do you institutionalize these things? That's why we're here.
And quickly, I'm glad you raised that, because while we're talking about New York City, the New York Conference of the NAACP represents the entire state. And so we have 56 branches throughout the state. Is this a model, is this a format that can be implemented in every county or in every municipality around the state? Or is this something that could only work or best work in New York City? Is this something that we can implement throughout the state?
You know, I would say, Gary, I'm a realist. There are places in this state where we don't have significant population of minority folks, right? So I'm not necessarily saying that this needs to be implemented all across New York State. I know where it does need to be implemented, where we have concentrations of people, of black and brown people,
right?
You know, throughout the state, at the county and city level, and obviously at the city of New York level.
Right. And NAACP needs to be able to work to make this happen, right?
You know, to your point, Gary, part of it is that the NAACP is at the table in the legislative session and beyond, but it's to create a new consciousness and a climate so that inclusion is a standard way of doing business. The problem is you got to fight to get in the room and then start all over with each new administration, with each new appointment. You would never say to the CFO, it's arbitrary whether you have to balance the books, right? It's a standard of excellence, as a standard operating procedure of what is acceptable. It's got to be a government that spends in our community on an equal basis.
But we have work to do. As NAACPers, we have to make sure that our electeds are doing what they're supposed to do, what we elect them to do, to create these structures and to enforce them, irrespective of administration.
And your appointeds, okay, because the electeds passed the legislation like 15A, which was an executive order of inclusion, which then became legislatively empowered. But the point is that after the electeds passed the legislation, then it's up to the various agencies and authorities to implement them. And you have people at the very top who are appointed and or serve at the pleasure of. But there's a whole bunch of other people, and they are the people who Paul referred to down the org chart. But they make multi-million-dollar decisions every day.
And those are the decisions that affect us as a community.
Absolutely.
Right.
I hear you. And this has been going on for years. How much progress do you think we've made, and how much progress do you think that we can make in the next few years? What do we need to do?
I would say one thing I can say for sure, we have made progress, right? Now, we could debate whether it's enough progress or not, but we've made progress. Like I said, when I came into DASNY in 2008, there was like 4% utilization. Now, in 2019, at the state level, there was 29% MWE utilization that equated to almost $3 billion, right? And from 2011 through 2019, there was almost $17 billion total NWE utilization. And those are dollars that would not have been in our community but for the progress that was started more recently by David Patterson and continued by Governor Cuomo. Now, have minority firms, have black firms achieved what we would say their fair share of that? Because blacks are about about 15% of the state of New York, 16%, and 26% of the city of New York, right? And the short answer to that is no. There's a gap between what black firms in particular, should be achieving versus what we are achieving, but we're achieving more than we were achieving. But there's progress to be made for sure.
There's work to be done.
Yeah.
Sure. Gary, I would add to what Paul has said in this fashion. COVID has exposed in some ways the fragility of the advances.
Right.
The existence of disparity, the fact that you have disparity studies is predicated upon the knowledge that things are not equal. Now, the COVID has exposed the fact that many of our advances were written in the sand. We have many businesses, black businesses, that are in jeopardy that they won't make it to New Year's Eve. And so, despite all the opportunities, we found out when the PPP loans went out, that banks walked away from, when the first round went out, the people at the front of the line were the Shake Shacks and others of the world
the larger corporations
who got six-figure loans, while our firms looking for $40,000 and $50,000 loans were not even responded to fill out their applications.
Right.
And so, and there was no enforcement of that. That would be, it seems to me, part of the purview of a CDO, but also it's really part of the role of you and the NAACP. We need the clout that you have from those 56 chapters to be ever vigilant to help us to monitor and then call out the shortcomings when they occur. Because right now, we're facing an unprecedented crisis that challenges all of our gains and our very existence in this economic milieu that they call America.
Well, let's talk about that some more, but first let's take this quick break.
Wherever we want to go, we just have to start. Auto save your way there with Chase. Chase, make more of what's yours.
Welcome back. Thank you for joining us in our discussion on economic development in New York State. We're going to just pick up with our discussion and talk about some of the metrics that have been involved in understanding the MBE world. Oftentimes, data is combined for women, African Americans, and Latinos, and it often muddies the water, I should say. So let me ask Paul, what can we do to break out the data so we can best understand how much business we're getting or how much business we're not getting? Because that's been a concern for years.
Absolutely. I'm a huge believer in transparency. And there's nothing more important than transparency when you're talking about public dollars and public procurement. And that's data that's owned by all of us, right? And it's data that's actually developed, maintained, and used internally, but not readily available to the public. Now, why is that? Because I guess they don't want us to see it. So what can we do about that? A couple of things. First of all, it should be on, I would think, on everybody's list of getting the leadership, the political leadership, to agree to disclose transparency at that level for all public procurements on a regular basis. We can get the aggregate, we can get the minorities aggregated, we can get the women aggregated, but we can't readily get the disaggregation of ethnicity and race as we should be able to get. That's very important. So number one, we need leadership at the NAACP level and others to make sure that that's a public pronouncement of folks that they will agree to do that. And then we need to make sure that at the agency level that there's pressure on the big agencies at least,
Right.
that they do that. Because once we get agencies to do it on any regular basis, the rest, I think the rest of the procurement world will fall into place as long as they know that people are pushing for it and they want that data. But it's only about transparency, and I don't know why it's not being done on a regular basis.
But you did that at DASNY.
We did, but DASNY, like any public authority, we fall within the world of the governor, whoever the governor is, and then those policies permeate down. So we didn't disaggregate by race and ethnicity to the extent that I would have liked, even because our data is collected and then sent upstream along with all the other public authorities and public agencies, and then it's dispersed in the annual reports, in the quarterly reports and annual reports. And that's where I'm talking about where it should be dispersed. We shouldn't have to go to every single agency and ask, well, can you get it from you? Can you get it from you?
Right.
Gary, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Right.
For over 26 years, what is now the Department of Education, the black and brown numbers are less than 4% combined. That's billions of dollars have gone out the door in a city where we represent over 40% of the population combined. How do we know that? Because while they don't have CDOs, we have moles. We have folk who report that data out, but it's surreptitiously. And so there's a critical role, and we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge your leadership in the NAACP in shining a light in an organization so that you can have an institutionalized response. But I'm ringing the alarm bell right now. These policies still exist through Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. We're still not getting our fair share. And other communities realize that at least if you're going to have viable businesses, that you ought to be able to participate in public dollars. That's the difference in our community.
And I've heard you say this before. The annual budget of the BOE is what? $5 billion?
It's multi-billions. It's $5 billion, but over the 26 years, it's been over in excess of $100 billion. Okay, and we've had, and the 3 to 4% is a recent number.
So we've had
in many
less than
years
3 to
it's been less than
4%.
1%.
Wow.
Right.
And for over 20 years. Okay. And I'm not telling about something I heard about. I was there.
And by the way, DOE historically has been one of the biggest spenders of public dollars in the field of technology, a field that's so critical to the future of everybody, but also for our own businesses and companies struggling to try to get an edge in here, edge in there, while the DOE was spending billions of dollars on technology, and we weren't, as the Reverend says, we weren't seeing much of anything out of that.
And here's the politics of data. The city and the comptroller have had a dispute for years about the measuring. So the city will record it on one level. As soon as a contract is committed, they'll take the whole sum of the contract and lump it into the first year, while the comptroller's office will do it as it's actually executed. And so you could win a $20 million contract over 4 years, but in the first year they only use you for $1 million worth, but they'll record it for the whole 20 million. So it's what I call trickeration with numbers. It's who's doing the counting and who's doing the presenting, and it's why the NAACP plays a critical role in holding feet to the fire. We've got to ask our elected officials, what do you know? Because many of them are very good at giving a 30-second cliche-filled speech, but they don't do their homework on our behalf.
One thing, just to build on that for a second, at the state level, one thing that we do at the state level, we only count utilization as cash in hand. So the state tracks payments to make sure primes and subs that were supposed to be paid out of MWEs actually got payment, and it's those payments that are tracked, not the promise to hire somebody and pay them, but the actual payment.
Sometimes I don't think we really understand what kind of dollar amounts we're talking about on the city and the state level. What is the city's budget on an annual basis? What are we talking about?
It was proposed in '93, and they cut $5 billion. And while they'll have everybody looking at the 5 that they cut, they're spending $88 billion.
Right. So there's $88 billion that our community is not able to participate in those contracts. Right?
Well, there are many elements in the
right. Sure.
I mean, there's the capital. The capital budget is the budget that really addresses a lot of the construction arena including capital equipment. But then you have the operating budgets that will include procurements for maintenance and operations, and then you have a couple other buckets, professional services, staffing and other things that may fall within another budget line. So it's not, when we say the city has an $88 billion budget, that's true. A lot of that's going for employees, for insurance, for this and that. The actual budget that's available for outside companies to procure, to compete for, is probably, as I recollect, in the city, it's probably between 20 and $30 billion, something like that.
So still, $30 billion is a lot of money.
Absolutely.
But what we're really saying is there are two budgets, right? And the capital budget is a multi-year budget.
Right.
So as you talk about, when you talk about a PLA, the PLA is a multi-year collective bargaining agreement.
Right.
So when they say things about year 1 and 2, they're not going to be here for year 3 and 4.
Right.
And so again, we have to be vigilant to participate in it, and we have to be informed. That's where the transparency comes in.
I think that it's important for our audience to understand that we're talking about billions of dollars on an annual basis. And it's important for us to understand as NAACPers, to your point, that we keep the pressure on our electeds who represent us so that we know what's available, what progress is being made, where we need to make these important changes, because this has to continue on an annual basis.
Gary, just this week, the Building Congress of the City of New York held an extraordinary panel discussion, and they talked about capital construction and social justice. First time they've ever appeared in the same sentence together. But it's a new concept that the monies that's just was brick and mortar actually has a social implication. When people have jobs in construction, they don't commit domestic violence. When they have jobs, young people don't join gangs. And so the economic stability provides a social stability in our community, which is why we fight so hard to achieve it.
Well, thank you both so much for your expertise and giving us some guidance on where we are and what needs to be done. We have a lot of work to do as an NAACP conference, and we will work with you cooperatively to make these things happen. So, thank you everybody for participating, and we look forward to your questions.
Now, our panelists are going live.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was absolutely outstanding. I love the Reverend's quote about if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. That is powerful and so true. So I'm going to kick it over to you, Gary. Take it away.
Thank you, Tracy. I really appreciate that. As you guys heard, the Reverend and Paul Williams were outstanding. They have been leading this fight for years. It is imperative that each one of us as NAACPers have a leadership role in our branches, in our regions, in our state. Do everything we can to articulate that economic development is a civil right. We have our game changers, and we've had our game changers for years, and we cannot forget that the dollars that are being spent by our elected leaders are our tax dollars. And so we have to ensure that we're able to participate in terms of these public sector resources, as well as still fighting the good fight for the private sector. So I'm going to open this up to some questions. There are some comments in the chat, and one of the ones that I see was about moving forward in terms of access to capital. And so I'm going to ask the Rev or Paul if you want to jump in here. What can we do about issues in terms of getting our businesses on a sounder footing so that they can participate in some of these governmental contracts, particularly when there are challenges with these agencies in terms of getting payments to these vendors in a timely manner? How can we address that?
Gary, I can take a shot at that. First of all, I think this is one of the areas that is an area that can be focused on that doesn't have a budget implication per se. One of the earlier panels, and by the way, this has been a fabulous conference. One of the earlier panels, one of the panelists indicated that it's going to be hard to fight for dollars, right? But this is a time to fight for constructive change to policy and legislation that may not have a budget impact. And this access to capital is one of those areas I think we need to spend some time to think about the public procurement payment process and identify perhaps strategies that will enable contractors to get paid in a more timely fashion. The state also has, and the city has various access to capital initiatives, and largely associated with credit facilities of some sort or the other. I think the city has initiated a grant program and a mobilization program, which that's all good. But I think there are other strategies that can be developed that get to more of the core issues of process and can get money into contractors' hands in a quicker fashion.
The New York City has used the School Construction Authority through its mentor program, as a program with Sterling Bank, where when a contractor wins the contract, they can get a mobilization loan tied to the contract. They have had over 140 loans with a zero default rate. The point that grows out of what Paul is saying is that we need to use our creative energies within existing laws to make it happen. And for where policies and procedures need to change, right now is to get busy time, because the budget and the processes for next legislative session are being developed right now. And so if you want to be in the next budget, what too often happens to us is the budget is being, budgets, even with this pandemic, budgets are being developed and then they're presented to us and we react. We need to be in right now and say as the executive budget is being developed, these procedures need to be implemented. And we need to unleash the creativity of the private sector with some incentives so that we can have access to capital. Too many of our businesses struggle, if not die, waiting to get paid for work that they perform. So after they go through all of these hoops to get certified, to get qualified, win the contract, then they struggle to survive. And the good news is you won the contract. The bad news is you won the contract.
Right.
Gary, before you leave that point, I want to address one common issue here. Most public agencies do a risk assessment of contractors before they're hired, right? And that's to make sure that, just to assure themselves that the group of contractors on the project are capable of delivering it, et cetera. There's nothing wrong with that. And typically, companies know they need a good safety rating, et cetera, to be able to get a broad-based access to public procurement. But what will happen sometimes if there's a litigation subsequent to the contract being executed, or during the contract, more likely, if there's litigation, payments may be held up entirely. So you might be, have a contract for landscaping or something, and then subsequent there's a litigation, and even though everybody knows that you've done your work, you're not going to get paid, because there's this theory that you've got to make sure that the liability doesn't flow downhill. Seems to me that that's an area that could be looked at, because the same kind of risk assessment could be done in cases of litigation to ascertain whether or not any of the subs or even primes that might be in the line of attack are likely to have liability exposure to any litigation. And if not, then let their money go. Just like, it may not be 100% foolproof, but nor is it 100% foolproof that the contractors you hired in the first place are going to do a 100% great job. So it's just a reasonable risk assessment that might allow, particularly in instances of liens and litigation, contractors that aren't implicated in any liability exposure can get paid.
So let me stay on that for a little bit. Rev, you mentioned that now is the time for us to really be focused on this. And I want to make sure that we have some action items here as the NAACP. So as you talk about budgets being created and issues being generated, what specifically would you recommend that we be focusing on as a state conference with these 55 or 56 branches throughout the state?
Well, I would follow up on what Paul said and piggyback on the analytics. The last reported numbers highlight which agencies are getting it done and how, and follow up with those agencies to make sure that their contract awards, we set goals. Instead of being reactionary, we need to be proactive. The NAACP should set some goals. They can do, you can do your own analysis and set some black and brown goals for 2021, 22 budget year. We need to be proactive. The NAACP has it within its capacity and with your allies to rate agencies. We ought to put out a report card on what governments are doing well and what governments are not doing well. We ought to be at the table and be able to do that and issue a report annually. So for instance, we should use the Black and Puerto Rican and Hispanic and Asian Caucus weekend to declare what the ratings are of various agencies. We also ought to identify some project goals on mega projects like JFK Airport, Moynihan Station, and other places, so that we see that we are in the game, so to speak. And lastly, when the budget hearings take place, we need to be present and help to raise questions. We cannot assume that legislators who look like us do for us, because we have found that when the lights turn off, the microphone is shut off, that some of those same legislators are our biggest adversaries.
Gary, I want to put some ideas out there for consideration, and some of these things have been bugging me for a long time. But earlier there was some talk about the fact that we don't really get data that's disaggregated enough. First of all, we've got to insist on that, and if it needs to be in legislation, then so be it. But the other thing is, we have an NWE program, and what we do at the state level is we have goals for M's and goals for W, right? But the M's include folks that were not necessarily subject to historical racism, segregation, and you name it, right? The M's include a broader group of folks that frankly are in the program on the coattails of Black folks that have been fighting for access to public procurement and access to opportunity since the 400 years when we got here, right? But be that as it may, that's not a irredeemable issue. But what we need to insist on is having goals for our groups. It perturbs me to this day. Women have goals that are all women goals, and that's fine. But there are segments of our community, Black folks, brown folks, particularly, that have not had the opportunity to get goals set for them, so that we can focus on where the disparities in utilization really are. And that's where the disparity is with Black and brown companies. So one of the things I think we need to do, certainly at the state level, is to put in some legislation that requires agencies to set goals, disaggregated goals based upon the appropriate formulas. And the city, which has the power to do that, needs to do it as a matter of process, and we shouldn't have to fight the city to do something that they're authorized to do already. And then we have to think about how those goals are applied at the agency level to projects. If we can aggregate projects to meet those goals, so we're not constantly chasing after authorities trying to get access to projects. Maybe there's a way to stack those projects across the spectrum of the MWE world, so that everybody knows, they've got X amount of projects to go after.
Paul, thank you. Rev, I thank you both. I think we have about 1 minute left. Let me just quickly ask the question. We've been talking about the public sector. How can we engage the private sector, the major corporations in our state and our nation, to also ensure that their spending is reflective of the communities that are as diverse as the communities that we serve?
Well, Paul?
That's a great question. One of the things that I think NAACP would be phenomenal at, New York is home to still, not as many as it used to have, but still home to a number of Fortune 500 companies. And NAACP could call a meeting with those entities, including the minority, Black and Latino, and other folks of color who are on their boards of directors, to start to focus exactly on that issue. Many corporations have supplier diversity programs, some of which are very successful. but I don't know if there's ever been an analysis of that regarding the businesses in New York City and in New York State. But that's an effort, and I think something like that could lead to other opportunities in terms of Black businesses maybe being able to also compete when some of these large companies want to spin off divisions or spin off some of their non-conforming companies or whatever. But there's a chance and an opportunity I think it should be taken.
Paul speaks to the initiative at the executive level and the board level, but there's also an initiative the NAACP could take and start to put a Black directory together and do their own certification and pre-qualification across a variety of areas and make that the gold standard for participation.
Thank you, Rev. Thank you both for your participation in this conference.
Thank you, and keep on keeping on.
Well, thank you all, and especially to you, Gary. What a way to close out our conference with this a really important topic and great informative speakers. So thank you very much.